In the beginning, Earth was a place without color, without life, without vegetation. During the first billions of years of its existence, this planet we now call home to the most diverse flora in the solar system was merely a glowing sphere of molten rock, wrapped in toxic gases and boiling primitive seas beneath a dark, oppressive sky. The Earth's crust was still slowly forming, in a delicate balance between constantly erupting volcanoes and acidic oceans filled with metallic compounds. The extreme conditions on the surface prevented any trace of green. The soil as we know it didn't even exist. Only vast fields of lava, boiling calderas, and mineral dust shaped the primeval landscape, an arid and inhospitable scene no terrestrial life form could inhabit. During the Hadean Eon, which lasted from about 4.6 billion to 4 billion years ago, Earth was still being bombarded by massive meteorites. The energy of these impacts could evaporate entire oceans, reconfigure the atmosphere, and impose cycles of constant destruction. Vegetation, which depends on stability, filtered sunlight, and stable liquid water, was still an absolute impossibility. There were no leaves, no trunks, no roots, just a boiling planet where life itself was still a chemical experiment in its earliest phase. The atmosphere was composed mostly of carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide, gases that would be lethal to any modern plant. Without a protective ozone layer, ultraviolet radiation struck the surface directly, making any attempt at terrestrial colonization by photosynthetic organisms unthinkable. As millennia passed, by the time of the Archean Eon, around 3.8 billion years ago, the first signs of life appeared, not on solid ground, but in the deep oceans. Cyanobacteria, also called blue-green algae, were the first organisms to master oxygenic photosynthesis. Although still invisible to the naked eye and living submerged, they would become the great precursors of everything that would one day sprout, bloom, and reach for the light of the sun. For hundreds of millions of years they multiplied in warm, shallow seas, forming sticky mats called microbial mats. These primitive organisms were the first to capture solar energy to transform carbon dioxide into organic matter, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. This silent process would initiate one of the greatest environmental revolutions in Earth's geological history, the oxygenation of the atmosphere. Yet during this early period, the planet remained a vast desert, without a single shadow cast by leaves or branches. The landscapes were composed of time-eroded mountains, sand dunes shaped by violent winds, and dark seas covered by bacterial crusts. The absence of vegetation also meant the absence of true soil. Without roots to hold sediments, acid rains washed away minerals and shaped the terrain with intense and constant erosion. Earth's surface was unstable, raw, and without a single trace of green. There were no floral scents, no chlorophyll, no phototropism, and no flowers. The only dominant colors were the grays of rock, the reds of cooled lava, and the murky blues of primitive oceans. It was a world of geological silence and atmospheric violence. During this long period, the biological structures necessary for vegetation had not yet evolved. There were no lignified cell walls, no vascular tissues for conducting sap, no spores, no seeds, no accessory pigments for photosynthesis. It was as if the planet were still writing the first lines of a book that would only later reveal the flourishing of plant life. Solar energy was already present, but no organism could yet capture it efficiently outside water. The carbon cycle was ruled by microorganisms, and biomass was almost imperceptible, hidden beneath liquid surfaces or sheltered in underwater crevices. Green was still just a remote possibility, an idea stored in the future of evolution. As cyanobacteria continued their slow and steady production of oxygen, the planet would begin undergoing an unprecedented transformation, the so-called Great Oxidation, which would forever alter the atmospheric composition of Earth. But in those early times, for nearly 2 billion years, the world remained a mineral desert, silent and gray, where every drop of life fought against hostile conditions on a still embryonic planet. The green that would one day cover entire continents still slept at the bottom of the oceans, waiting for the right moment to emerge, conquer the land, and forever transform the history of life. In a time so distant, it escapes human comprehension, when the continents had not yet fully formed and the sky was a thick mass of toxic gases, Earth's primitive oceans began to shelter the first signs of life. These seas, dark and warm, rich in dissolved iron and volatile chemical compounds, were nothing like the ones we know today. They were denser, more acidic, and geologically active at a deep level. In these unstable and deep waters, in regions where magma spewed from the seafloor through hydrothermal vents known as black smokers, simple organic molecules began to organize. And there, in an environment that today would seem hostile and alien, emerged the first living beings capable of capturing sunlight and converting it into energy: cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are not plants, but they rank among the most important organisms in the entire history of life. They were the first photosynthetic beings capable of using solar energy to transform carbon dioxide and water into organic matter, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. This biological invention, oxygenic photosynthesis, would completely transform the planet. Before them, Earth was dominated by life forms that relied on chemical energy sources like methane and sulfur. But with cyanobacteria, sunlight became the engine of life. Their tiny bodies multiplied by the trillions in shallow seas, forming vast microbial mats, sticky carpets that covered the ocean floor and created mineral structures known as stromatolites. These stromatolites, which can still be found today in places like Shark Bay in Australia, are the living fossils of the earliest era of photosynthesis. Each layer represents thousands of years of microbial growth, like geological pages written by invisible beings. They are witnesses to a time when there were no leaves, trunks, or roots, yet photosynthesis was already converting light into energy, laying the foundation for the food chain. For hundreds of millions of years, cyanobacteria dominated the oceans, spreading everywhere and slowly altering the chemistry of the planet. They began releasing oxygen into a world that had never known it before, and this gas, initially toxic to many of the life forms of the time, began to accumulate in the atmosphere. This slow but continuous process led to the so-called Great Oxidation, about 2.4 billion years ago. For the first time in Earth's history, oxygen became a significant component of the atmosphere. The impact was immense. Dissolved metals in the oceans began to precipitate, forming massive banded iron deposits that are mined today. The atmospheric composition changed, becoming less reducing and more oxidizing. And although this oxygen caused a mass extinction of anaerobic organisms, it also paved the way for more complex life forms based on aerobic respiration, and much later for the formation of the ozone layer, which would allow plant life on solid ground. But at that early stage, cyanobacteria were still the undisputed rulers of the oceans. They floated in colonies, clung to submerged rocks, and wove the first ecological webs based on photosynthesis. Unknowingly, these tiny organisms were preparing the soil, or rather the water, for everything that would come afterward. They had no roots, no leaves, no stems, but they created oxygen, absorbed light, and built the biochemical balance necessary so that billions of years later, giant trees, colorful flowers, and tropical forests could breathe. The story of vegetation began there, almost imperceptibly, with beings invisible to the naked eye swimming in mineral waters beneath a heavy, aggressive sky. During this long era, Earth remained a blue planet, but not yet a green one. Photosynthesis was a process confined to water, limited to the domain of cyanobacteria, and later some simple algae. Nothing had yet ventured beyond the marine environment. Life was deeply dependent on water, both for sustenance and for protection against intense solar radiation. The terrestrial soil remained sterile, dry, infertile, and exposed, but beneath the waves, silently, life was learning to master light. And with this new way of capturing energy, the plant world was beginning to be born, not as forests, but as a delicate shimmer of chlorophyll floating between the waves. It was this shimmer, multiplied billions of times, that slowly transformed the planet. Over time, new photosynthetic lineages would emerge, leading to the diversity of algae and the evolution of the first true plants. But cyanobacteria, humble and persistent, were the pioneers of this process. They were the first gardeners of Earth, preparing the stage so that one day the continents could be covered with mosses, ferns, forests, and flowers. All the green we know has metaphorical roots in those ancient blue bacteria. And even today, billions of years later, their lineage still lives in every plant cell, inside the chloroplasts, where photosynthesis continues its silent work. turning light into life. Long before Earth was covered by forests, and even before any terrestrial plant had appeared, the life we know as vegetal was already taking its first evolutionary steps, not in the form of leaves or flowers, but as complex microbial mats that dominated the submerged surfaces of the planet's early oceans. During the Archean eon, between approximately 4 billion and 5 billion years ago, Earth was still a forming planet, where continents were fragile, unstable masses of molten rock. The sky remained murky and hostile, and life found shelter only in the warm, shallow depths of the seas. It was in this mineral-saturated and high-temperature environment that microbial mats emerged as the first visible ecosystems, a testament to the tenacity and ingenuity of life in its most primitive forms. These mats were not vegetation as we know it, but dense organized layers of microorganisms, mainly cyanobacteria, growing on submerged surfaces like rocks, mud, and shallow reef platforms. Greenish, bluish, or brownish in color, these biofilms not only covered the seafloor but also interacted chemically with the environment, precipitating minerals, releasing gases, and slowly transforming Earth's composition. They functioned as collective organisms, multiple species grouped into overlapping layers, each one specialized in an ecological role, some in light capture, others in nitrogen fixation, others in radiation shielding or excretion of toxic substances. This level of biological complexity, organized without brains, organs, or higher structures, marks one of the first large-scale examples of biological cooperation. These microbial mats created the conditions for the formation of stromatolites, sedimentary structures formed by the biological activity of these microorganisms, which trapped mineral particles from the environment and fixed them in layers. Over time, these deposits built up into limestone domes, forming small underwater hills. Each layer of a stromatolite records a different era, like growth rings telling a silent and profound story. These living fossils, found in places like Greenland, South Africa, and Western Australia, are the oldest geological evidence of life on Earth. And though they contain no leaves or roots, they are the first physical manifestations of planetary bioengineering, a natural system capable of transforming geology through biology. The importance of these mats goes beyond their antiquity. They were the first to perform oxygenic photosynthesis on a large scale, contributing decisively to the so-called Great Oxidation, which began around 2.4 billion years ago. By releasing oxygen as a byproduct, these microorganisms radically changed the composition of the atmosphere and oceans. Oxygen first accumulated in the seas, reacting with dissolved iron and forming vast layers of banded iron ore, and later began seeping into the atmosphere. Though slow, this process deeply altered the planet's dynamics, even causing extinctions among anaerobic organisms that couldn't survive the growing presence of this new gas. Microbial mats didn't just sustain life, they redefined the rules of the environment in which life would evolve. Still, during the Archean, Earth remained a visually barren world. There was no green on the continents, no flowers in the fields. Ocean margins were made of bare volcanic rocks, with no soil or shade. But if it were possible to walk along those ancient shores, what one would see under the shallow waters were glimmering, undulating colonies of photosynthetic microorganisms, thin carpets breathing light and releasing gas. In this silent landscape, microbial mats were the planet's first gardens, invisible to the modern eye, yet carrying all the principles that would, billions of years later, bloom into trees and flowers. These mats were also the first ecosystems to generate microenvironments with stable chemical gradients. Within them arose interactions like light competition, symbiosis, and mutualism, biological interactions that would later be crucial for the formation of complex plant communities. Moreover, by altering the chemical makeup of their environment, these microorganisms created zones rich in nutrients, minerals, and organic compounds, paving the way for the emergence of the first eukaryotes and, eventually, the first multicellular algae. Modern plant life would still take over 1 billion years to appear, but its foundation was laid during this era of deep silence and invisible complexity. In the Archean, then, there were no leaves swaying in the wind or lush forests. But the foundations of plant life were being meticulously erected by billions of microorganisms working together under the faint light of a still young sun. These microbial mats not only created oxygen and organic matter, they built the soil of life itself, not geological soil but biological, where the roots of terrestrial vegetation would one day grow. And even though their colors were subtle and their existence silent, they represented the first great step toward the domestication of sunlight. The story of plants, with their colorful flowers and vibrant leaves, began there, in a colorless world, shaped by invisible communities breathing light in the depths of time. For nearly 2 billion years, Earth existed in a profound silence, where green was still only a future promise, and life remained confined to the dark, shallow oceans. In this setting, the presence of photosynthetic organisms like cyanobacteria was gradually modifying not only biology, but the very chemistry of the planet. Each tiny cell, fueled by sunlight, transformed water and carbon dioxide into organic matter, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, a gas that until then was not part of Earth's ecosystems. Slowly, with geological patience, cyanobacteria filled the oceans with this invisible and reactive element until it began to escape into the atmosphere. And then, the world changed. The Great Oxidation, or oxygen catastrophe, was a planet-scale event that radically altered the course of life's history, laying the groundwork for the emergence of vegetation as we know it. This process began around 2.4 billion years ago, during the late Archean and early Proterozoic eons. At first, all the oxygen produced was quickly consumed by chemical reactions in the ocean, especially with dissolved iron. This formed gigantic layers of iron oxides, known as banded iron formations, which today are mined around the world. But when that supply of iron was finally exhausted, the oxygen began to escape from the water and accumulate in the atmosphere. This gas, which we now associate with breathing and life, was initially a threat to many life forms of the time, which had evolved in anaerobic environments. For them, oxygen was a poison, a toxic substance that destroyed metabolic pathways. So the Great Oxidation was not just a victory for life, it was also a silent mass extinction that eliminated many primitive microorganisms and cleared the way for more complex and resilient life forms. As oxygen became more abundant, it began interacting with ultraviolet light from the sun. From this interaction, a new layer formed in the atmosphere, the ozone layer. Composed of triatomic oxygen molecules, ozone started absorbing intense ultraviolet radiation, creating a protective shield that drastically reduced the damage to life on Earth's surface. Without this natural filter, no organism could survive outside water, where UV rays caused lethal mutations. The formation of the ozone layer was therefore a crucial step in the history of terrestrial life. Without it, no plant could have ever colonized the continents. Photosynthesis had produced oxygen, and oxygen in turn had generated atmospheric protection. It was as if life itself were preparing the stage to evolve into bolder and more complex forms. In this context, the first green algae emerged, eukaryotic organisms that would become the direct ancestors of modern plants. Unlike cyanobacteria, green algae had true cell nuclei and more sophisticated internal structures. They evolved through a remarkable symbiotic event. An ancestral eukaryotic cell engulfed a photosynthetic cyanobacterium, which, instead of being digested, began living inside the host cell, eventually becoming what we now know as a chloroplast. This symbiotic fusion was a cellular revolution, a lasting alliance between two distinct life forms, capable of transforming sunlight into energy with unprecedented efficiency. Green algae began to spread across the oceans, absorbing light and producing oxygen even more effectively, expanding the photosynthetic influence on a global scale. With these new algae, marine biodiversity increased and biogeochemical cycles became more complex. Food chains began to depend increasingly on photosynthesis, and the organic matter produced started to accumulate in ocean sediments. These deposits would be fundamental in forming stable, nutrient-rich environments that would later be inhabited by multicellular organisms. Photosynthesis was no longer just an energy source. It was establishing a new balance between the atmosphere, ocean, and biosphere, shaping the necessary conditions for plant life to flourish. The very composition of the air became more favorable for aerobic respiration, allowing the evolution of larger, more complex and energetically demanding cells, a path that, billions of years later, would culminate in the existence of trees, flowers, and entire forests. Even though green algae remained confined to the seas for millions of years, their impact on the atmosphere and the planet as a whole was irreversible. Earth, once a world suffocated by methane and carbon dioxide, began to breathe oxygen. Sunlight, once a constant threat to terrestrial life, became an ally, filtered by an increasingly stable atmosphere. Photosynthesis was no longer just a chemical process confined to water. It had become a planetary force capable of altering climate, transforming landscapes, and defining the boundaries of life. Every drop of ocean illuminated by these algae carried within it the potential for a green future that, though still distant, was slowly and inevitably approaching. Thus, the Great Oxidation and the rise of green algae marked a fundamental transition in Earth's history. For the first time, the planet became truly habitable, not just for microorganisms, but for an entire future lineage of photosynthetic beings, from mosses to ferns, from conifers to tropical rainforests. The air we breathe today, the oxygen that feeds our cells, and the atmospheric stability that sustains our forests, all of it has its origin in that ancient period when invisible beings altered the destiny of an entire world. The path to terrestrial vegetation had been prepared, and now, under a newborn blue sky, life was beginning to dream of solid ground. On a planet still dominated by oceans, beneath a sky increasingly rich in oxygen and protected by the newly formed ozone layer, photosynthetic life was making a crucial evolutionary leap. Cyanobacteria had paved the way, filling the air with oxygen and transforming the oceans into chemically stable environments. But now a new lineage was emerging, one that would not only inherit photosynthesis, but refine it, expand it, and eventually carry it onto land. These were the first green algae, eukaryotic organisms that appeared between 1.5 and 1.2 billion years ago and would eventually give rise, many millions of years later, to all terrestrial plants. Though invisible to the naked eye, these algae carried within them the promise of entire forests, blooming meadows and leaves rustling in the wind, a silent revolution beginning in the blue depths of ancient seas. What made these green algae so special was the presence of chloroplasts, internal structures that performed photosynthesis with great efficiency. These chloroplasts were, in fact, descendants of ancient cyanobacteria that had been engulfed by ancestral eukaryotic cells in a symbiotic event known as primary endosymbiosis. This union between two distinct organisms gave rise to a new type of cell, capable of capturing light, converting solar energy into organic compounds, and sustaining itself independently. It marked the beginning of a new biological era. These green algae belong to the group known as chlorophyta, and their internal structure, biochemistry, and genetics revealed a direct kinship with terrestrial plants. They contained both chlorophyll A and B, stored starch in their plastids, and had cell walls rich in cellulose, features that would later be inherited by higher plants. The diversity of these algae expanded rapidly. Some began to live in colonies, forming simple multicellular structures, while others developed flagella and became mobile, able to swim toward light. This active and adaptive behavior opened the door to new aquatic life forms with varied strategies for reproduction, nutrient absorption, and cell division. In the Proterozoic seas, these green algae spread across submerged continental platforms, reefs, and shallow lakes, forming dense photosynthetic fields that rivaled the productivity of the ancient cyanobacterial mats. They began to occupy a wide range of ecological niches, diversifying into filamentous, spherical, and flattened forms. And although they were not yet visible in the landscape, their biochemical impact was already profound. Oxygen levels continued to rise, water clarity increased, and nutrient cycles grew more complex. Over time, some of these green algae began to display surprising adaptations. They developed more robust structures to resist fluctuations in salinity, temperature, and light intensity. Some species evolved rudimentary mechanisms to anchor themselves to substrates, a strategy that would later be essential for the emergence of land-based plants. Others developed alternation of generations, a life cycle alternating between haploid and diploid stages, offering greater genetic flexibility in changing environments. This alternation would become a defining feature of future terrestrial plants. Green algae were not merely surviving, they were experimenting, testing, and creating new paths for photosynthesis and environmental occupation. Plant life was being shaped here, cell by cell, experiment by experiment, generation by generation. Meanwhile, Earth's atmosphere continued to transform. Rising oxygen levels reduced methane concentrations, cooling the planet and ushering in new climatic cycles, including the first global glaciations. Green algae endured these extreme cycles, becoming even more resilient. They learned to survive beneath ice, in cold waters, and under low-light conditions. Each environmental challenge shaped their genetics, selecting lineages that were increasingly adaptable. From this lineage would eventually emerge the charophytes, a group of freshwater green algae that share the closest common ancestor with terrestrial plants. The charophytes would develop rhizoid-like structures, anchoring mechanisms, and cellular protections against desiccation, all essential traits for the eventual conquest of solid ground. It is fascinating to think that tropical forests, wheat fields, fruit trees, gardens, and even the grass beneath our feet are all direct heirs of those invisible green algae swimming in ancient seas. Though they had no flowers, trunks, or roots, these algae contained all the basic ingredients that would later be reorganized into far more complex forms. Their legacy lives on in every chloroplast, in every leaf cell, in every molecule of chlorophyll present in every living plant today. They were the invisible architects of a verdant future that would take hundreds of millions of years to emerge on Earth's surface. Thus, the first green algae were not merely successful aquatic organisms. They were the evolutionary link between unicellular cyanobacteria and terrestrial vegetation. They were the laboratory of modern photosynthesis, the cellular womb of botany, and the first draft of what would become the living tapestry of the continents. In every drop of water that sheltered these pioneers, the planet was preparing for something monumental. There were still millions of years to go before green life would rise on land, but the path had already been drawn, beginning in the moist, sunlit interiors of the primitive green algae. Before photosynthesis, life on Earth was a biochemical whisper hidden in the shadows. The first organisms survived by exploiting deep and limited chemical sources: sulfur, methane, dissolved iron. It was a secluded existence, confined to oceanic fissures and dependent on geothermal heat, a life without light, without oxygen, without complexity. But at some point, billions of years ago, a group of microorganisms developed the ability to capture the energy of the sun. They didn't just harness the light, they tamed it, transformed it into vital force, into growth, into matter. This process, called photosynthesis, was the most important turning point in the history of life on the planet. Not only because it sustained the photosynthetic beings themselves, but because it altered Earth's chemical balance and created the conditions for all higher life forms, including the plants that would later cover entire continents in green. Photosynthesis is, in essence, a biochemical miracle. With sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, organisms are able to produce glucose, a chemical source of energy, and release oxygen as a byproduct. This process takes place inside cellular structures called chloroplasts, which contain photosynthetic pigments such as chlorophyll. These pigments capture photons of light and use them to move electrons, generate ATP and NADPH, and finally fix carbon. In more primitive organisms such as cyanobacteria, this process was already remarkable, but in green algae and later in plants, photosynthesis would become even more efficient and sophisticated. What matters most, however, is the cumulative impact of this innovation. Photosynthesis enabled large-scale creation of organic matter, supporting entire ecosystems and releasing enough oxygen to change the planet's atmosphere. That atmospheric transformation was radical. Over billions of years, oxygen accumulated in the air, altering geological cycles, oxidizing minerals, and allowing the evolution of aerobic respiration, a process far more efficient than fermentation or anaerobic respiration. Living beings could now extract much more energy from their food, paving the way for the emergence of larger, multicellular organisms with accelerated metabolisms. Photosynthesis didn't just create oxygen, it created the possibility for biological complexity. And that's why it can be said without exaggeration that photosynthesis is the organizing force of terrestrial life. It is the silent engine behind biodiversity, climate stability, soil formation, and the structure of all ecosystems. The conquest of light also transformed the planet visually. Over time, green came to dominate the landscape, a result of chlorophyll reflecting specific wavelengths of visible light. That vegetal aesthetic, the green of leaves, the gleam of forests, the vastness of meadows, is a direct consequence of how photosynthetic pigments interact with solar radiation. Even Earth's appearance from space, the iconic blue and green that sets it apart from other celestial bodies, is a direct product of photosynthesis. More than a chemical process, it is a planetary phenomenon, shaping the atmosphere, geography, and even our perception of what life is. Light was no longer just a source of heat. It became a biological currency, a tool for construction, a bridge between star and cell. With the expansion of photosynthesis, the organisms that practiced it became the primary producers of all ecosystems. They formed the base of the food chains, supporting herbivores, which in turn fed carnivores, and so on. The entire web of modern life depends on this vegetal and algal foundation that converts solar energy into food. This applies to grasslands, forests, coral reefs, swamps, and even deserts. In all these environments, life begins with photosynthetic organisms. Even today, more than 90% of all biomass on the planet is composed of photosynthesizing beings, mainly terrestrial plants. Without them, there would be no agriculture, no oxygen to breathe, no food for animals or humans. Photosynthesis is, therefore, the invisible link that keeps the planet running. From this point on, the evolution of plant life took new directions. Organisms began to compete for light, adapting to grow taller, to form larger leaves, to spread horizontally. Strategies such as phototropism emerged, the ability to move or grow toward light. Others developed accessory pigments to capture different bands of the light spectrum, optimizing photosynthetic efficiency even in shaded environments. This evolutionary pressure would shape plant design for millions of years, from creeping mosses to towering canopy trees. Light was no longer just energy. It was a precious resource to be contested, a shaping force of plant architecture, a constant stimulus for evolutionary innovation. That is why the history of vegetation cannot be told without understanding the central role of photosynthesis. It does not merely feed, it structures. It does not just sustain, it propels. With the conquest of light, plant life gained autonomy, scalability, and above all, planetary power. The world that was once ruled by subterranean chemical reactions and oceans of dissolved iron now breathed light. And although terrestrial plants had not yet emerged, all the fundamental elements were already in place. Green algae swam beneath the sunlight, chloroplasts danced within their cells, and oxygen filled the skies. Photosynthesis had triumphed, and it was only the beginning. For billions of years, all life was confined to the oceans. There, protected by water and nourished by the sunlight that penetrated the surface, algae and cyanobacteria dominated the photosynthetic world. But something extraordinary began to happen around 480 million years ago during the Ordovician period. For the first time in Earth's history, photosynthetic organisms dared to leave the aquatic environment and occupy the harsh, dry spaces of the continents. This transition was one of the most challenging in evolutionary history, as it meant facing the sun directly without the water's protective filter, enduring winds, extreme temperature variations, scarcity of liquid water, and direct ultraviolet radiation. Yet, despite these obstacles, green life broke through the limits of the ocean and laid the first threads of chlorophyll across the rocky ground. Mosses and liverworts were born, the first terrestrial plants in history. These primitive plants belonged to the group known as bryophytes, small organisms, usually just a few centimeters tall, lacking complex structures like true roots, vascular tissues, or seeds. They lived attached to moist soils, at the edges of lakes, on wet rocks, and in regions constantly blanketed in mist. Their bodies were simple, made up of structures called corloids and phylloids, rudimentary equivalents of stems and leaves. Instead of deep roots, they had rhizoids, filaments that anchored them to the substrate and helped absorb water. They lacked internal vessels like modern plants, and thus depended directly on environmental humidity to survive. Even so, their presence on land represented a true revolution, the conquest of solid ground by photosynthetic beings, something never seen before. Adapting to the terrestrial environment required major innovations. One of the most important was the development of spores with resistant walls, capable of surviving desiccation and dispersing through the air. These spores allowed bryophytes to colonize new territories, even in places far from permanent water sources. Another crucial innovation was the waxy cuticle, a thin, waterproof layer that coated the exposed surfaces of the plant, reducing water loss through evaporation. While this layer was thin and rudimentary in the first bryophytes, it would later be perfected and become essential in all modern terrestrial plants. Protected reproductive structures also emerged, where gametes were housed in internal chambers to prevent drying out. This combination of adaptations marked the beginning of terrestrial botany, with green organisms taking root, however modestly, on a planet once dominated by bare, desert-like rocks. The presence of these plants on land had profound environmental impacts. First, they began physically breaking down rocks, producing organic acids and initiating the formation of the planet's first true soil. Where there had once been only stone, organic matter began to accumulate. Moisture was retained, and a habitat was created for microorganisms. Even though the vegetation was low and sparse, it started to modify the local hydrological cycle, retaining water, stabilizing slopes, and helping to trap sediments. These processes were essential for building the foundations of terrestrial ecosystems. At the same time, photosynthesis outside of water began to contribute directly to the atmosphere, increasing oxygen levels on land and fostering the development of humus-rich soils, rich in decomposing plant material. Bryophytes also introduced new ways of interacting with the environment. By absorbing carbon dioxide directly from the air, they influenced the global climate by reducing the greenhouse effect. Research suggests that the expansion of these terrestrial plants may have contributed to global glaciations at the end of the Ordovician period by extracting large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere. Furthermore, by covering the soil with a thin layer of vegetation, they created microhabitats for other organisms. Fungi, small invertebrates, and bacterial colonies began to benefit from the new stability and moisture provided by these green carpets. Vegetation was no longer an exclusively aquatic phenomenon. It now deeply influenced terrestrial ecological cycles. Despite their importance, bryophytes didn't form forests or provide shade. They were discreet, silent, and often mistaken for rock moss or slimy patches. Yet their contribution to evolutionary history is immense. They paved the way for the emergence of more complex plant forms, like vascular plants, which would arise in the periods that followed. By dominating moist, shaded environments, bryophytes literally and figuratively prepared the ground for the diversification of terrestrial flora. Their descendants would spread across the planet, colonizing slopes, riverbanks, damp caves, and eventually drier and drier regions. Even today, in tropical forests, tundras, and high mountain regions, mosses and liverworts continue to play fundamental ecological roles. Thus, the first steps of plants on land were not marked by towering trees or explosions of flowers, but by small, resilient organisms that knew how to explore the cracks in rocks and the moisture of water's edge. They were the ones who silently began weaving Earth's surface with threads of green, covering the mineral desert with the promise of shade, life, and nourishment. Each moss that grew over a stone was a seed of the future, a sign that the planet was about to transform once more. The path of vegetation on land had begun, and nothing could stop it. The Silurian period, which began around 443 million years ago, was the stage for a silent and profound transformation. For the first time, the terrestrial landscape began to gain permanently green contours. The world that had once been dominated by bare rocks and arid surfaces was slowly being covered by plant organisms that not only survived on land, but also transformed the very soil beneath them. Bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts had been the pioneers, opening paths in humid environments. But now a new lineage of plants was establishing itself with greater strength and complexity. The Silurian was the era when the first true roots began to interact with the soil, transforming it from mineral substrate into living, fertile, breathable earth. It was the moment when the land began to breathe as a complete ecosystem, thanks to the advancing green life. These early, more complex Silurian plants already had internal structures called vascular tissues, which allowed the efficient transport of water and nutrients. These tissues, xylem and phloem, were fundamental for the colonization of slightly drier environments, as they allowed plants to grow taller and maintain metabolism even without being submerged or constantly saturated. Primitive roots began to penetrate the ground, fragmenting rocks and accelerating the formation of fine mineral particles. By interacting with bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms, these roots gave rise to the modern concept of fertile soil, a living, dynamic system where organic and mineral matter blend and nourish the surrounding biodiversity. The soil as we know it is a creation of plants, more specifically, of the green expansion that began in the Silurian. These primitive vascular plants did not yet have true leaves. Their bodies were made up of simple branched stems, sometimes upright, other times creeping. Their photosynthetic cells were distributed across the stem surface, which was sufficient to capture sunlight in an environment with little competition. But the presence of vessels and roots marked a turning point. Plants could now grow toward the light, reaching several centimeters, then tens of centimeters, preparing for an evolutionary race that would eventually lead to gigantic trees. Among the pioneering groups of this period were the rhiniophytes, represented by the genus Cooksonia, one of the oldest plant fossils ever found. These small plants, just a few centimeters tall, are symbolic of the transition between mosses and the shrubby forms that would dominate the Devonian. At the same time, the development of roots and vascular tissues allowed plants to expand their ecological reach. They began to occupy riverbanks, moist slopes, lowland meadows, and coastal regions, shaping microclimates and establishing the first terrestrial plant niches. The green cover, still sparse and low to the ground, was already beginning to affect soil temperature, moisture retention, and even rainfall erosion. Where water once ran off directly over bare rock, it was now partially retained by plant mats and underground roots. This retention increased infiltration, enriched soil with organic matter, and fostered the emergence of microbial communities associated with vegetation, such as mycorrhizal fungi. The symbiosis between plants and fungi, in fact, is a legacy of this period and remains one of the most successful biological partnerships on Earth. Silurian vegetation also began to influence the global carbon cycle. As plants performed photosynthesis and removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they contributed to a gradual cooling of the climate. Roots, by breaking rocks and forming soils, exposed new minerals capable of reacting with CO2, locking it into carbonate formations. This dual impact, biological and geochemical, reduced the greenhouse effect and stabilized Earth's climate, preparing the environment for the explosion of plant life that would unfold in later periods. The Silurian, therefore, was not just the time of roots and stems. It was the beginning of a sophisticated interdependence between biosphere and geosphere, where vegetation began to act as a planet-shaping force far beyond its microscopic dimensions. Visually, the world was still not lush. Forests did not exist, but up close the first fields of tiny green stalks, with upright sporangia launching spores into the wind, already hinted at a new era. In coastal and marshy zones, where tides receded and left the soil exposed, entire colonies of these primitive plants could be seen competing for space and light. It was low vegetation, but persistent, and that persistence was all evolution needed. In every germinating spore, in every root that dug deeper, the planet gained a little more stability, a little more life, a little more green. The Silurian was the laboratory where the concept of fertile soil was tested and approved, and from that living soil, everything would bloom. In the heart of the Silurian, and with full blossoming in the Devonian period, around 420 to 360 million years ago, a structural change revolutionized the history of plant life on Earth, the emergence of vascular plants. This seemingly simple innovation would forever alter the way plants occupied space, manipulated resources around them, and interacted with their environment. Until then, terrestrial plant organisms depended directly on ambient moisture to survive. They were short, fragile, and limited in size because they lacked an efficient internal system for transporting water and nutrients. But with the evolution of specialized vascular tissues, such as xylem and phloem, plants were no longer hostages to constant humidity. They began to conquer drier environments, rising toward the sky and digging deeper into the soil. It was the beginning of a new kind of terrestrial life, vegetation with height, strength and resilience. Xylem, made up of elongated lignified cells, enabled the vertical conduction of water and mineral salts absorbed by the roots to the upper regions of the plant. In addition, it provided structural support, allowing stems to grow upright and longer. Phloem, on the other hand, was responsible for the bidirectional transport of sugars and photosynthesis products, feeding different parts of the plant in a coordinated way. Together, these two systems created an internal distribution circuit that freed vegetation from the spatial limitations of mosses and liverworts. Now, plants could grow taller, expand their light-capturing area, and colonize soils with variable water availability. This capacity meant ecological autonomy, and with it came the possibility of building the first complex habitats on dry land. With this anatomical revolution, new plant groups emerged with much more diversified morphologies. Among the main representatives were lycophytes, xylophytes, and euphylophytes, technical names for the plants that dominated the Devonian and shaped Earth's first green landscapes. Some had simple leaves, others bore leaf-like structures known as microphyls. Some reproduced through spores released from specialized structures, others already displayed rudimentary adaptations that would later evolve into seeds. The stems became thicker, segmented with forked branches and later lateral axes, allowing increasingly branched, efficient and adaptable plant forms in the race for sunlight. As these vascular plants evolved, their root systems also grew deeper and more efficient. Roots began to penetrate further into the ground, cracking underground rocks, releasing essential minerals, and contributing to the formation of increasingly fertile soils. This intense interaction between roots and minerals triggered geochemical processes capable of altering soil pH, fixing carbon, and feeding entire ecological chains. Moreover, roots created channels through which rainwater could infiltrate, carrying dissolved nutrients and maintaining moisture in the deeper soil horizons. The growth of roots also influenced the physical structure of the soil, making it more porous, better aerated, and more suitable for hosting microorganisms and symbiotic fungi. Subterranean life, often overlooked, was directly propelled by this new generation of vascular plants. These plants did not merely dominate the land, they shaped the climate. With high rates of photosynthesis and accelerated growth, vascular plants sequestered enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, contributing to a global cooling that culminated in the glaciations at the end of the Devonian. The release of oxygen increased, the atmospheric composition became more stable, and the planet began to enter a cycle of biochemical balance that favored biodiversity. The dead trunks of these plants, rich in lignin, decomposed slowly, forming massive deposits of organic matter that would later become the first coal reserves. The world was not only gaining vegetation, it was beginning to store its biological history underground in fossil layers formed by the very first forests. Visually, the landscapes of the late Silurian and early Devonian began to change dramatically. Where once riverbanks and lake shores were covered with short, sparse moss colonies, they now featured dense, upright plant communities with rigid structures reaching unprecedented heights. Vegetation started to form more continuous cover, creating shade, microclimates, evapotranspiration cycles, and most importantly, stable environments where animals could find shelter, food, and opportunities for reproduction. Earth was beginning to host the first truly terrestrial ecosystems, with complex flora, internal hydrological cycles, and organized trophic chains. The vascular revolution was not merely a change in plant structure, it was a reinvention of the terrestrial surface, with profound impacts on geology, climate, and global biodiversity. Thus, the introduction of vascular tissues marked the beginning of a new era in the history of plant life. The green earth we know today, from tropical rainforests to tundras, from sequoias to farmlands, is a direct consequence of this anatomical innovation that began hundreds of millions of years ago. Every tree, every flower, every seed carries within it the evolutionary memory of the first vascular plant that dared to grow upward, conduct water through its body, and live far from the dependency of aquatic margins. The vascular revolution became the backbone of modern vegetation, a silent yet powerful achievement that elevated Earth's greenery from a humble carpet to the grandeur of a forest. During the Devonian period, which began about 419 million years ago, the planet witnessed one of the greatest ecological transformations in its history. the birth of the first forests. Until then, vegetation was limited to small organisms, ground-hugging colonies, and stems only a few centimeters tall. But by this time, plants had accumulated the anatomical and physiological innovations necessary to reach greater heights. The presence of vascular tissues allowed for the efficient internal transport of water and nutrients. Roots grew deeper, stems thickened and branched out, and leaves, though still primitive, increased the capacity to capture sunlight. This marked the emergence of a new type of ecosystem, the vertical forest, a living architecture of plants rising toward the sun, competing for light, creating shade, humidity, and biological complexity on land. For all these reasons, the Devonian is known as the Age of Primitive Forests. Among the plant giants of that era stood the genus Archaeopteris, an enigmatic and pioneering tree that reached heights of up to 20 meters. Although it reproduced by spores, like modern mosses and ferns, its woody structure and complex branching patterns foreshadowed the characteristics of modern seed-bearing trees. Archaeopteris had deep roots, a robust trunk, and a broad canopy, marking the beginning of specialization in plant architecture. Branches strategically positioned to capture light, leaves angled to minimize self-shading, and trunks capable of supporting large masses of elevated vegetation. It was no longer just about growing. It was about growing smartly in an adapted way, optimizing sunlight use and creating microenvironments beneath its shade. These Devonian forests were not made up of flowering plants as we know today, but of giant lycophytes, primitive sphenophytes, and large tree ferns. The humid environments favored spore dispersal, and constant rains kept the soil saturated with nutrients. Plants clustered densely in floodplains near rivers and swamps, forming dense groves that deeply modified the water cycle and soil composition. For the first time, Earth was covered by vegetative canopies where sunlight was filtered through layers of leaves and the ground remained moist and dark. Beneath these canopies, ideal microclimates formed for primitive insects, fungi, microorganisms, and even the first terrestrial vertebrates. Vegetation no longer just covered the world. It compartmentalized it, created vertical levels, and extended life in all directions. With the proliferation of these forests, the global climate was profoundly impacted. The increase in continental-scale photosynthesis led to massive carbon dioxide withdrawal from the atmosphere. This carbon sequestration, combined with deeper soil formation and biomass deposition, contributed to a significant reduction in the greenhouse effect, cooling the planet. Paleoclimatic models suggest that Devonian forests were responsible for initiating glacial cycles and altering regional climate patterns. Furthermore, the accumulation of organic matter from these forests led to the formation of the first coal deposits, creating natural fossil energy reserves that would shape the planet for millions of years. Carbon, once circulating freely in the atmosphere, now began to be preserved in geological layers, a chemical memory of a verdant world. The complexity of these forests also brought evolutionary challenges. As vegetation grew taller, competition for light intensified. This forced plants to develop more elaborate growth and reproductive strategies. Some species evolved thinner and broader leaves, others increased their height, and some began exploring sexual reproduction with specialized gametes. Although seeds had not yet emerged, the need to protect spores from drier environments became clear, setting the stage for the later revolution of gymnosperms. The Devonian was not just a time of growth, it was a time of adaptive innovation, where environmental pressures demanded new solutions and evolution responded with more complex structures, more efficient reproductive strategies, and more refined architecture. Seen from above, one would observe vast plains covered in tall, dense vegetation, interspersed with winding rivers and waterlogged zones. Winds blew through the canopies, carrying spores over long distances. Rain fell on broad leaves, ran down woody trunks and infiltrated the rich, dark soil. Beneath this vegetal covering, a new world was emerging, not just for plants, but for animals too. The first terrestrial arthropods walked among the stems, early amphibians emerged from rivers, and ecological interactions multiplied. The primitive forest was the womb of complex terrestrial life, and its ecological impact would shape not only biology, but also the physical landscape of the planet. With the emergence of Devonian forests, vegetation ceased to be just a ground-hugging carpet. It became living architecture. an organic infrastructure capable of supporting complex ecosystems, altering the climate, regulating the water cycle, and sculpting the terrain. Every modern tree, from fig trees to sequoias, carries the genetic legacy of those pioneers. Every upright trunk, every wide canopy, every deep root is an echo of evolutionary decisions made during the Devonian. This was the time when vegetation found its verticality, and with it, molded the world we now call home. Between about 359 and 299 million years ago, the planet entered the Carboniferous period, an era so densely covered in vegetation that its very name derives from the principal legacy left by its forests: coal. During this interval, Earth was transformed into a vast tropical archipelago dominated by immense humid megaforests that blanketed coastal plains, swamps, shallow lakes, and waterlogged valleys with a green density never seen before. These forests were composed of a profusion of giant plants, tree-like ferns, colossal lycophytes, towering horsetails, dense mosses, and thick vegetation that formed continuous, shaded canopies, capable of keeping the soil perpetually moist and teeming with life. It was a living, pulsing planet, where the cycle of photosynthesis reached its peak and the plant kingdom reigned supreme over the continents. The trees of the Carboniferous were unlike anything that exists today. Particularly prominent were the giant lycophytes, such as lepidodendron, which could grow up to 30 meters tall with scaly trunks and spiral-shaped branches. These plants did not produce seeds, but rather released enormous quantities of spores into the air in thick clouds carried by the wind. Other dominant plant forms included sphenophytes, like calamites, which resembled modern horsetails but reached heights of nearly 20 meters. These were prehistoric vegetations with primitive physiologies, yet remarkably well adapted to shallow water swamps. They grew rapidly, reproduced efficiently, and died easily, leaving behind a massive accumulation of organic biomass in waterlogged, poorly drained soils. Over time, this plant matter was buried under sediments, compressed and gradually transformed through geological processes into fossil coal, the same fuel that today heats homes, powers industries, and supports entire economies. The Carboniferous environment was extremely humid, warm, and rich in oxygen. Atmospheric oxygen concentrations reached 35%, significantly higher than today's 21% due to the intense photosynthetic activity of these forests. This had direct consequences on terrestrial ecosystems. Insects and arthropods grew to colossal sizes. Dragonflies, such as Meganeura, had wingspans of up to 70 centimeters, while giant millipedes like Arthropleura reached lengths of up to 2 meters. These creatures lived beneath the dark forest canopies, in a sweltering, vibrant world where every square meter was filled with life, decay, and relentless growth. The soils were thick and moist, layered with organic matter in continuous recycling. The interaction between vegetation and the atmosphere was so intense that plants not only influenced local weather patterns, they regulated the global climate, maintaining stable temperatures and high humidity. Within this context, the carbon cycle underwent a dramatic transformation. With the constant production of biomass and its subsequent burial in deep layers, vast amounts of carbon were removed from the atmosphere and stored in sediments. This carbon sequestration reduced the greenhouse effect and contributed to the gradual cooling of the planet. Toward the end of the Carboniferous, setting the stage for the glaciation at the beginning of the Permian period. Forests therefore did more than sustain terrestrial biodiversity. They rewrote Earth's climate cycles, acting as natural carbon sinks and controlling global temperature with their own leaves and roots. It was a sophisticated system of ecological self-regulation, where green vegetation shaped the blue of the sky and the soil became a deep archive of planetary history. Vegetal life in the Carboniferous also witnessed the beginning of a crucial evolutionary process, the emergence of the first seed-bearing plants. Although still rare, early gymnosperms began to appear in drier and more elevated regions, signaling a transition from spore-dominated swamps to the future dryland ecosystems of the Mesozoic. Seeds offered protection for the plant embryo, enabled long-distance dispersal, and provided independence from water for fertilization, an advantage that would be extensively explored by plants in the millions of years to come. Thus, the Carboniferous was also an evolutionary nursery, where the genetic and structural diversity of plants expanded exponentially, paving the way for forests that were more resilient, complex, and ecologically dominant. Visually, the planet was green, dense, and dark. Swamps stretched for thousands of kilometers, interlaced with murky water channels and slow-moving rivers. Tall, slender trunks rose toward the sky, their fan-shaped canopies filtering sunlight and casting the undergrowth into perpetual dimness. The air was humid, saturated with spores and organic mist. With every rainfall, nutrients were recycled and roots fed on living decomposition. It was a vegetal Earth, a planet that breathed through leaves and fed on light. And even without flowers, fruit, or grass, this world already carried the grandeur of modern forests, with their ability to transform landscapes, alter climates, and support life across multiple trophic levels. The Carboniferous was, in essence, the culmination of everything vegetation had built up to that point: structure, function, spatial dominance, and atmospheric influence. The tropical megaforests of this era did not merely cover the Earth, they reinvented it. They created the coal we still use, the oxygen we breathe, and the ecological blueprint that would sustain all subsequent ages. The sound of those forests might have been that of a world murmuring through leaves, breathing through spores, and whispering through trunks, a world where green truly became the living skin of the Earth. Deep within the humid forests of the Carboniferous, towering vegetal forms rose with majesty, ruling the terrestrial world with absolute dominance. Giant ferns, colossal lycophytes, and vertical sphenophytes. These plants not only defined the planet's aesthetic during that period, but also represented the evolutionary peak of lineages that had emerged millions of years earlier, during the first steps of plant life on land. Together, they shaped the physical and ecological world with such intensity that their buried, compacted, and fossilized remains literally became the fuel of modern civilization: coal. Every fallen trunk, every leaf dropped on the waterlogged soils of Carboniferous swamps is now part of a geological memory that warms us, moves us, and connects us to a distant past, to a planet where green became colossal. Tree-like ferns with trunks reaching up to 10 meters in height stood like vegetal pillars within the humid woods. Their leaves, called fronds, could exceed 5 meters in length and uncoiled in elegant spirals, a pattern known as circinate vernation, still a botanical symbol of ancient heritage today. Unlike modern trees, their trunks lacked true wood and were instead composed of fibrous vascular tissues arranged in concentric rings. This structure gave them strength and flexibility, allowing them to bear the weight of their leaves, constant rainfall, and tropical winds. These ferns did not produce seeds. Their reproduction relied on the release of spores in massive quantities into the environment, an efficient strategy in moist forests but limited in drier regions. The giant lycophytes, such as Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, were the true titans of the Carboniferous. Reaching up to 30 meters tall, these plants had an alien-like appearance. Trunks covered in geometric scale patterns, the scars left by fallen leaves, narrow-leaved crowns, and wide roots that formed horizontal structures known as stigmarian systems. Unlike modern trees, these plants grew rapidly and had relatively short lifespans. There were no growth rings as seen in today's trees. Their structure resembled that of bamboo, growing quickly to a maximum height, reproducing, and then dying. Their spores, highly flammable, filled the air in immense concentrations, making these ecosystems extremely prone to natural fires during dry periods. Still, their ability to regenerate and proliferate was remarkable. Swamps would return within just a few decades, supported by new generations of these vegetal giants. The sphenophytes, represented mainly by the genus Calamites, were ancestral relatives of modern horsetails. In the Carboniferous, these plants reached heights of up to 20 meters and had hollow, jointed trunks segmented by nodes, with fine leaves arranged in whorls at branching points. They grew in a column-like fashion and often appeared in dense rows along riverbanks and flooded plains. Their life cycle was also spore-based, with reproduction occurring through structures called strobili, located at the ends of their branches. Sphenophytes were versatile. They grew quickly, tolerated waterlogged soils, and played a crucial role in stabilizing riverbanks, preventing erosion and contributing to the formation of nutrient-rich sediments. Together, These three dominant plant lineages created a three-dimensional world of vegetation, where every stratum, from roots to canopy, was inhabited by specialized forms of life. Their shady crowns reduced light penetration to the forest floor, favoring organisms adapted to darkness. Their trunks hosted microhabitats for fungi, insects, lichens, and microorganisms. Their deep, intertwined roots formed underground networks for nutrient exchange and soil stabilization. And when they died and were buried, their remains were not simply recycled. They were preserved in anaerobic layers that, over time and geological pressure, formed the vast coal deposits that now heat the industrialized world. The legacy of these plants remains visible today, not only in the impressive fossils found in carbon-rich layers, but also in the genetic structures of their descendants. Today's mosses, ferns, and horsetails are living relics of those ancestral forests. Even in miniature, they carry the strategies, reproductive cycles, and architectural patterns of the Carboniferous titans. Their DNA still holds the blueprints for thriving in wet environments, launching spores into the wind, resisting shade, and colonizing riverbanks. They are silent survivors of a time when Earth was so green that the very air smelled of decaying vegetal life. Lastly, it is important to remember that this vegetal dominance did not come without consequences. The immense amount of carbon fixed by plants and stored in sediments led to a significant imbalance in the atmospheric cycle, contributing to the glaciation that marked the end of the period. Vegetation, in its own silent way, had shaped not just soil and atmosphere, but the planet's climatic destiny. It was definitive proof that plants, though silent, possessed the power to transform worlds. In the Carboniferous, that power manifested in the form of green titans that elevated vegetation to its structural and ecological peak, writing with leaves, trunks, and roots one of the grandest chapters in Earth's history. At the end of the Carboniferous period, Earth entered a cycle of profound climatic changes that would culminate in the collapse of the tropical megaforests. With the beginning of the Permian period, around 299 million years ago, the continents began to slowly merge into the supercontinent Pangaea, radically altering atmospheric circulation patterns, rainfall distribution, and climate regimes. This geographic reorganization brought with it a drastic reduction in global humidity, and the vast Carboniferous swamps, once lush nurseries of tree ferns, lycophytes, and sphenophytes, began to dry out. Tropical forests collapsed in successive waves of local extinction, and landscapes once densely vegetated became dry plains, intercontinental deserts, and arid regions. It was the end of a lush era and the beginning of a world where only the most resilient plants would survive. In this new hostile scenario, with scarce rainfall and extreme temperatures, most moisture-dependent plants went extinct. The giant lycophytes disappeared almost completely. Tree-like ferns and horsetails, once dominant, retreated to narrow, humid ecological niches. With the collapse of the swamps, carbon sequestration also declined, and the atmospheric cycle began to warm again, further worsening the arid conditions. Yet amid this ecological devastation, one group of plants showed extraordinary adaptability: the gymnosperms. Unlike their predecessors, these plants did not rely on water for reproduction. Instead of releasing spores into a moist environment, they produced seeds protected by resistant coatings, capable of withstanding desiccation and traveling long distances, often carried by the wind. Gymnosperms represent one of the greatest innovations in terrestrial botany. Their ability to encase the plant embryo within a seed gave them not only reproductive independence, but also the advantage of germinating in favorable conditions, even after long dormancy. Moreover, their leaves evolved into structures adapted to drought, such as the needle-like foliage of conifers, featuring thick cuticles, sunken stomata, and tissues resistant to water loss. These modifications not only reduced transpiration, but also allowed these plants to thrive in poor, cold, or water-scarce soils. Gymnosperms were not born of lush environments. They thrived where others failed. Several groups of gymnosperms emerged during the Permian, most notably conifers, cycads, and ginkgophytes. Conifers, for instance, began to dominate elevated regions, slopes, and arid zones. Their woody trunks and deep roots enabled them to access underground water sources, while their winged seeds ensured efficient dispersal across dry, open landscapes. Cycads, which resembled modern palms but are biologically distinct, colonized tropical and semi-arid regions, and the ancestors of the modern ginkgo biloba, with their fan-shaped leaves and unique reproductive cycles, emerged as living fossils from a time when resilience mattered more than abundance. These plants formed new open forests with sparse canopies, tougher leaves, and reduced dependence on moisture. Forests designed to survive the elements. Meanwhile, the soil itself began to change. With less dense vegetative cover, the humus layer became thinner and decomposition processes slowed down. The reduced availability of organic matter affected microbial communities and nutrient cycling. However, gymnosperm roots compensated for this impoverishment through symbiotic associations with mycorrhizal fungi, enabling the efficient extraction of phosphorus and nitrogen even from poor substrates. In this way, these plants established new forms of ecological balance, no longer based on the humid abundance of the Carboniferous, but on adaptive efficiency and resource conservation. It was within this less fertile yet biologically ingenious world that the ecosystems capable of withstanding the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history took shape. By the end of the Permian, around 252 million years ago, a series of catastrophic events, including colossal volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, drastic global climate shifts, and ocean acidification, led to the extinction of over 90% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial species. The dry gymnosperm forests, with their resilient physiology and minimalist architecture, were among the few plant formations able to cross this ecological abyss. They survived where most perished, and this resilience would make them the dominant plants throughout the Mesozoic era, the age of the dinosaurs, shaping terrestrial ecosystems for more than 150 million years. Thus, the Permian marks a turning point, from lushness and humidity to scarcity and endurance. The swampy tropical forests of the Carboniferous gave way to dry open forests adapted to a transforming planet. Vegetation ceased to be merely lush and became strategic, and at the heart of that strategy stood the gymnosperms, silent survivors of a planet in crisis, who turned scarcity into opportunity and wrote with their protected seeds the next chapter in the story of life on Earth. The history of vegetation, up to this point marked by slow progress and resilient conquests on a changing planet, reached its darkest chapter at the end of the Permian period, about 252 million years ago. At this moment in geological history, Earth underwent the largest mass extinction ever recorded, an environmental collapse of planetary proportions that devastated entire ecosystems and nearly wiped out complex life. Known as the Permian Triassic extinction, or the Great Dying, this catastrophe was not merely a marine event like many before it. It struck both oceans and continents with brutal force, destroying forests, fields, swamps, roots, and canopies alike. For the first time, Earth's vegetation collapsed systemically. The triggers for this extinction were multiple, simultaneous, and violent. Massive volcanic eruptions in the region of present-day Siberia, known as the Siberian Traps, released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur into the atmosphere. This caused a runaway greenhouse effect, raising Earth's temperature by several degrees Celsius in just a few thousand years, geologically instantaneous. The extreme heat disrupted rainfall patterns, dried up rivers and swamps, increased soil acidity, and halted plant growth cycles. At the same time, the acidification of rain and oceans interrupted the cycling of essential nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, vital to plant metabolism. Where green once thrived, there was now ash. Where forests once stood, sterile deserts emerged. Vegetation vanished en masse, leaving the soil exposed, eroded, and lifeless. Fossil records show a drastic reduction in the diversity of spores and pollen, a clear signal that plants were dying, failing to reproduce, or simply unable to maintain their populations. The sudden disappearance of entire forests was followed by the collapse of land-based ecosystems that depended on them. Herbivorous animals starved, predators died in sequence. Soil microorganisms fell into imbalance, and decomposing fungi dominated the fossil record, indicating a world filled with dead organic matter, but no regeneration. Vegetation, which for millions of years had been Earth's ecological engineer, now fell to its knees under the weight of climatic instability. atmospheric acidification, and environmental toxicity. Gymnosperms, despite their prior resilience, also suffered severe losses. Many conifers vanished, and cycads and ginkgophytes were nearly wiped out. Only Wetzil, a few groups of plants with extreme adaptations, tough leaves, slow metabolism, and seeds capable of prolonged dormancy, managed to survive. Global vegetation became sparse, fragmented, and thin. Canopy density dropped to minimal levels. Soils lost their ability to retain moisture. The hydrological cycle became erratic. Rivers dried up seasonally, and riverbanks, once lush and stable, became dominated by opportunistic plants, such as simple ferns and hardy mosses, clinging to life in unstable environments. The planet entered an age of ecological desolation. This devastating scenario persisted for millions of years. It's estimated that the planned recovery of terrestrial vegetation after the Permian extinction took roughly 5 to 10 million years, an eternity in ecological terms. During that time, the planet experienced extreme thermal fluctuations, global hyperthermal periods, ozone layer collapses, and intensified volcanism. Ecosystems remained fragile, and plant life struggled to reclaim lost ground. The most favorable regions were those near bodies of water, where relative humidity allowed some herbaceous species to grow. Slowly, the surviving gymnosperms began to diversify once again, filling empty ecological niches and giving rise to the lineages that would later dominate the Triassic period. The devastation of vegetation during the Permian had long-lasting consequences for the soil. The absence of deep roots and continuous plant cover led to a massive erosion, sediment compaction, and the loss of organic matter. Many soils were literally washed away from the surface, leaving behind impoverished landscapes with low fertility and damaged physical structure. This loss of fertile ground hindered plant recovery, creating a negative feedback loop that delayed ecosystem resurgence. Only over time, through the slow action of fungi, lichens, and pioneering plants, did soil profiles begin to regenerate. The planet, once draped in green for millions of years, now struggled to relearn how to wear its living skin. The Permian extinction is a sobering reminder that vegetation, though seemingly passive, is deeply sensitive to planetary cycles. It is the first to respond to climate change. It sustains all other life forms. It keeps the soil breathing, the atmosphere stable, and biochemical cycles in balance. When vegetation collapses, the entire planet staggers. And when it falls silent, Earth becomes a desert where time seems to freeze. Fortunately, life found ways to resist. The buried seeds, the dormant spores, the silent genes carried by resilient plants were the guardians of the green future. Thanks to them, Earth would bloom again, but never in the same way. From that point on, a new world was beginning, and the plants that would come to dominate it would have to carry the memory of the collapse that nearly erased everything. After the vegetative silence imposed by the Permian extinction, the planet slowly began to recover its green cover. The beginning of the Triassic period, around 252 million years ago, was marked by a world in reconstruction. The humid forests of the past had disappeared. Soils that were once fertile and deep were now eroded and compacted. The atmosphere still held high concentrations of greenhouse gases, and hydrological cycles remained unstable. Yet even in this hostile environment, plant life found ways to persist. And the protagonists of this rebirth were the resilient gymnosperms, especially the conifers, which would become Earth's dominant vegetation for over 150 million years, shaping the ecological landscape in which dinosaurs would emerge and become the rulers of the animal world. Conifers belong to a group of plants with naked seeds, meaning they are not enclosed in fruits, protected only by woody scales grouped into structures known as cones. Unlike ferns and lycophytes, which still relied on spores and moist environments to reproduce, conifers had a life cycle completely independent of water, giving them a major advantage in dry or seasonal environments. Their seeds could remain dormant for long periods, germinate in poor soils, and withstand extreme climates. Their needle-shaped leaves, long, thin, covered with a thick cuticle, and with sunken stomata, minimized water loss to the greatest extent. These were such effective adaptations that they allowed these plants to dominate everything from rocky deserts to mountain slopes and emerging temperate forests. During the Triassic, the supercontinent Pangaea was still intact, resulting in extreme climates, with arid continental interiors and tropical coastal zones. Even so, conifers thrived, creating landscapes of sparse vegetation, open canopied trees, rigid leaves, and relatively slow growth. Genera such as Voltsia, Araucarioxylon, and Lebachia are examples of primitive conifers that dominated Triassic ecosystems. Many of these trees exceeded 20 meters in height, forming open and hardy woodlands, capable of withstanding strong winds, low rainfall, and nutrient-poor soils. It was a drier, less lush world than the Carboniferous, but equally functional in ecological terms and profoundly resilient. The rise of conifers didn't just signify the return of vegetation. They restored the carbon cycle, capturing atmospheric carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and releasing oxygen in quantities sufficient to help stabilize Earth's climate over millions of years. Their deep roots helped restore soils, fix nutrients, stabilize slopes, and promote the infiltration of rainwater. Their fallen trunks formed the basis of a new layer of organic matter, and their cones fed the first large terrestrial herbivorous vertebrates, such as the cynodonts and later the dinosaurs. Once again, vegetation rebuilt the foundations of life, not with tropical exuberance, but with patience and endurance. Over time, these conifers began forming dense forests in wetter regions and open woodlands in arid zones. The ecological role of vegetation diversified. Some species acted as pioneer species, colonizing eroded and inhospitable soils. Others formed permanent forests, with deep roots and a high capacity for carbon retention. The first structured conifer forests appeared during this period, shaping microclimates and creating E-zones of shade, humidity, and shelter, which enabled the diversification of small animals, reptiles, insects, and microorganisms. The world that had nearly died at the end of the Permian was now being reorganized by these discrete plants, rebuilding green life where only ruin had remained. It was also during the Triassic that the first modern cycads appeared, with compound leaves and thick trunks that resembled palm trees, though they belonged to the same group as conifers. These plants were common in tropical and semi-arid regions, and their tough tissues and unpalatable taste discouraged heavy herbivory, allowing them to occupy vast stretches of territory with relative safety. Alongside them, ginkgophytes established themselves as broad-leaved deciduous trees, capable of withstanding dry and cold seasons. Although today only descendants of the ginkgo biloba survive, in the Triassic these plants were widespread and diverse. Visually, the planet took on darker shades of green. These forests had no flowers or colorful fruits. They were woodlands of needles and leathery leaves with towering canopies and sturdy plant columns. The dominant sounds were the wind brushing through needles, the dry rustle of falling cones, and the heavy silence of a world under reconstruction. It was in this setting that the first dinosaurs walked. Small and bipedal at first, timid herbivores and agile predators, all dependent on gymnosperm vegetation as their primary energy source. The relationship between plants and animals began to deepen in new ways, not just as shelter or shade, but as a central trophic structure, where food, refuge, and reproduction became intertwined. The Triassic, then, was a time of reconstruction, of recolonization, of vegetal adaptation to scarcity. Conifers were the engineers of this new world, reassembling the systems that had collapsed and preparing the planet for the great explosion of life that would come in the Jurassic. They taught us that not all greatness comes through abundance. Sometimes it emerges through resilience, through the persistence to grow even in the harshest environments, and the ability to remake the world with cones, needles, and firm roots. Green had returned, and this time with roots even deeper in Earth's history. After the slow reconstruction of terrestrial ecosystems during the Triassic, the Jurassic period, which began around 201 million years ago, revealed to the world a new vegetative landscape, denser, more humid, more exuberant. With the gradual breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea, climates began to stabilize, rainfall became more frequent, and inland seas started to influence continental moisture. The planet was warming gently, deserts were retreating, and greenery expanded once more with vigor. For the first time since the Permian devastation, terrestrial vegetation formed mature, expansive forests, capable of sustaining a growing biodiversity of animals. Among them, the giant dinosaurs that would define the era. Yet the dominant plants were still not flowering species. They were resilient gymnosperms, cycads, conifers, ginkgos, and tree ferns, which united to form the Jurassic woodlands, filled with thick canopies, leathery leaves, and a deep, ancestral green serenity. Cycads, a group of gymnosperms that resemble modern palm trees though unrelated, were ubiquitous in tropical and subtropical forests. With their thick trunks, compound leaves, and slow growth, these plants formed dense colonies, often on poor soils with little competition for light. Their tough leaves, protected by repellent chemicals, made them unattractive to herbivores, which favored their survival. Many species had dioecious reproduction, with separate male and female plants, and their reproductive cones were elaborate, often brightly colored or aromatic. This complexity marked an evolutionary stage of increasing specialization in plant reproduction, a sign that life on land was refining its tools. Among these plants, ginkgos played a special role. During the Jurassic, there were various species within the group, now represented solely by Ginkgo biloba. These trees had fan-shaped leaves with radiating veins and exhibited a mix of deciduous and evergreen traits. Cold-tolerant, drought-resistant, and highly regenerative, ginkgos thrived from tropical plains to temperate hillsides. Their woody tissues allowed vertical growth, and their presence in Jurassic landscapes was constant. Moreover, they were a food source for many herbivorous dinosaurs, and their fleshy fruits, though foul-smelling to us, attracted animals and facilitated seed dispersal. The relationship between plants and animals became increasingly complex, more symbiotic, more sophisticated. Conifers, meanwhile, remained the backbone of Jurassic forests. Genera like Araucaria, Podocarpus, and Chirolepidaceae dominated vast regions, forming dense woods with interwoven canopies and leaves adapted to varying light and moisture regimes. Some species thrived on mountain slopes, others in riverine plains, and some reached heights of 50 meters, creating complex, shaded vegetative canopies. These trees were essential not only for large-scale photosynthesis, but also for maintaining soil moisture and stability. Their woody trunks fed decomposer fungi, their cones nourished reptiles and primitive birds, and their deep roots structured the environment in lasting ways. Beyond gymnosperms, the Jurassic witnessed an explosion of ferns and horsetails, which thrived in shaded, humid areas near rivers and lakes. Tree ferns, up to 15 meters tall, formed internal jungles, creating moist, low-light environments ideal for insects, small vertebrates, and soil microorganisms. These plants, although ancestral from an evolutionary standpoint, proved incredibly efficient in low-competition, low-canopy settings, filling the lower forest strata and completing the vertical vegetative architecture that characterized Jurassic ecosystems. Vegetation now not only grew upward, it was organized in layers, distributed light across plant groups, and increased the diversity of ecological niches. This rich, diverse vegetative structure had a profound impact on my planet's climate. Jurassic forests sequestered vast amounts of carbon dioxide, helping regulate global temperatures and creating a mild greenhouse effect, ideal for life to flourish. The moisture released through leaf transpiration fed clouds, enhanced rainfall, and sustained the hydrological cycle. Soils became deeper, more fertile, more stable. Vegetation was now not just surface cover. It was ecological and climatic infrastructure, a system linking atmosphere, geology, biology, and time. Visually, Jurassic ecosystems were awe-inspiring. Tall forests with interlaced canopies, leathery leaves swaying in the wind, cones hanging from branches, ferns sprouting from the ground, ginkgos shedding golden leaves in cold seasons. Amid this scene, herbivorous dinosaurs like stegosaurs, diplodocuses, and apatosauruses fed on high canopies, tough leaves, and succulent stems. Each bite from these giants left plant scars, quickly healed by regenerative tissues. Jurassic vegetation was not mere background. It was a living character in the megafaunal drama, adapting, resisting, and in many cases, co-evolving with the colossal creatures of the age. The Jurassic teaches us that exuberance doesn't require flowers. Even before the rise of angiosperms, vegetation was already sophisticated, complex, and biologically dominant. Every needle, leaf, and cone was the result of millions of years of silent adaptation, shaped by light, moisture, and persistence. Earth, now fully green, breathed with planetary regularity, sustained by deep roots and towering canopies. And thus, under the watchful gaze of the dinosaurs, the planet entered its age of wood and resin, of leathery leaves and fertile cones, the grand era of gymnosperm forests that ruled the world for millennia, until the arrival of the greatest botanical innovation in history, flowers. For millions of years, Earth's vegetation was shaped by resilient gymnosperms, trees with tough leaves and reproduction based on naked seeds. Conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and ferns dominated forests, swamps, and slopes, sustaining Jurassic ecosystems with resilience and stability. But around 135 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, a new kind of plant began to emerge quietly among the roots of these ancient giants. At first they were small, rare, and barely noticed, but they would soon reveal their true evolutionary power. These pioneers bore a revolutionary trait: flowers. And with them came the group that would go on to dominate all modern vegetation on Earth, the angiosperms, or flowering plants with seeds protected inside fruits. It was the beginning of a silent revolution, where color replaced gray, aroma guided reproduction, and sweet fruits forged new alliances between plants and animals. Angiosperms are indeed one of the greatest innovations in the history of plant life. Their key characteristic lies in the presence of enclosed ovaries, which protect the ovules during development and transform into fruits after fertilization. This structure offers multiple advantages. It shields the embryo, enables seed dispersal by animals, and significantly increases reproductive success. Moreover, their flowers, with a vast array of shapes, colors, and scents, allow for much more specialized and efficient pollination than the wind-dispersed pollen of gymnosperms. Angiosperms began attracting insects, birds, and even flying reptiles, forming complex symbiotic relationships, where plant and pollinator evolved side by side, refining their interactions with each generation. The first fossils of angiosperms appear in lower Cretaceous sediments and belong to small herbaceous plants with simple leaves and modest flowers. One of the oldest known fossil genera is Archifructus, found in China and dated to about 125 million years ago. It features primitive floral structures and elongated fruits, showing that even in their earliest form, these plants already possessed the full suite of innovations. As the Cretaceous progressed, angiosperms rapidly diversified, occupying niches once ruled by ferns and gymnosperms. In less than 50 million years, they spread across all continents, taking over the essential ecological functions of terrestrial vegetation, ground cover, primary production, forest formation, and support for animal biodiversity. This expansion had a profound impact on ecosystem structures. Angiosperms grew faster, reproduced in shorter cycles, and displayed greater ecological plasticity. Their tissues were more nutritious and palatable for herbivores, which encouraged coevolution with ornithischian dinosaurs, such as hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, which began feeding on tender leaves, floral buds, and fruits. Seed dispersal also became more dynamic. Sweet, colorful fruits attracted animals that carried the seeds in their intestines over long distances. Vegetation no longer relied solely on wind or water for dispersal. Now it flew with birds, walked with reptiles, ran with mammals. Plants and animals became ecological allies, exchanging nourishment for mobility. By the end of the Cretaceous, angiosperms had conquered tropical landscapes, temperate regions, and transitional zones. Mixed forests of conifers and angiosperms became widespread, and the first modern floral ecosystems began to take shape. Flowering trees, fruit-bearing shrubs, grasses, vines, and creepers formed a rich, dense, and diverse vegetation. This new landscape influenced soil composition, atmospheric humidity, the water cycle, and above all, the trophic structure of biomes. The diversity of flowers led to an explosive diversification of insects, especially bees, butterflies, and beetles, whose modern lineages took shape alongside angiosperms. It was an explosion of colors, forms, and flavors, a world pulsing with renewed energy, sustained by deeper roots and more secure seeds. At the same time, angiosperms evolved reproductive and growth strategies with unparalleled efficiency. They developed broad, thin leaves to maximize photosynthesis, specialized root systems for various soil types, and complex reproductive forms with hermaphroditic, self-pollinating, or externally pollinated flowers. Some species developed seed dormancy mechanisms, while others began to sprout from underground rhizomes. The morphological diversity of angiosperms surpassed that of all previous plant lineages. They adapted to heat, cold, drought, shade, and salinity. Every ecological challenge was met with new genetic variations, resulting in a botanical catalogue that, in just a few tens of millions of years, took over the planet. Visually, the late Cretaceous world was far more colorful than previous periods. Flowered meadows, deciduous forests, shrubs with red and violet fruits, leaves with varied textures and shades. Where once dull greens of gymnosperms and browns of ferns had prevailed, now emerged yellows, blues, whites, magentas, and purples. The scent of flowers hung in the air, guiding bees and moths. Fruits dangled from trees, feeding early birds, small mammals, and even omnivorous dinosaurs. It was the Earth in bloom, a planet where evolutionary aesthetics became functional, where beauty served survival, and where vegetation not only adapted to the environment, it transformed it. The emergence of angiosperms marks the beginning of modern vegetation. Every plant we cultivate, eat, admire, or use today, from roses to apples, from rice to coffee, descends from this evolutionary turning point. Flowers, once they appeared, never vanished, and their fruits became not just food, but symbols of abundance, renewal, and connection with animals. From that moment onward, Earth would be forever a planet of flowers. And this botanical blooming, so recent in geological terms, was what ensured the planet's resilience even after the impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. Because where there is a flower, there is a pollinator. Where there is fruit, there is dispersal. Where there is a seed, there is future. After the emergence of the first angiosperms in the early Cretaceous, what followed was a true evolutionary explosion. In just a few million years, a mere blink in geological time, flowering plants went from being a botanical curiosity among gymnosperms to becoming the most dominant and diverse group in terrestrial vegetation. The so-called angiosperm radiation completely transformed the planet. Its landscapes, atmospheric chemistry, climate, and all terrestrial food chains. It wasn't just the flowering of plants, it was the flowering of the world as we know it. Earth entered its floral era, and for the first time, vegetation became a planetary system of extraordinary ecological complexity, where form, color, scent, seasonality, and reproductive strategy intertwined with all other living beings. The secret to the success of angiosperms lay in their reproductive efficiency and ecological adaptability. Flowers, highly specialized structures, enabled precise, selective, and often mutualistic pollination, reducing pollen loss and increasing fertilization rates. While gymnosperms released massive quantities of pollen into the wind, hoping chance would favor them, angiosperms invested in attracting living pollinators, insects, birds, mammals, using vibrant colors, intricate shapes, nectar, and specific aromas. This intimate relationship with pollinators created a cycle of coevolution that accelerated the diversification process. Plants and animals began to shape each other, refining each generation of flower and each generation of pollinator with new characteristics. It was a silent dance between petals and wings, between pollen and proboscises, between offering and reward. In addition, the development of fruits enabled new seed dispersal strategies. Fleshy, sweet, and nutritious fruits began to attract a wide range of dispersers. Birds, bats, primates, rodents. Other fruits, dry and winged, floated on the wind or drifted in water. Some bore hooks that clung to animal fur, while others used mechanical explosion to launch seeds meters away. This variety ensured that angiosperms colonized all environments on Earth, from deserts to tropical rainforests, from frozen steppes to remote islands. The ability to produce protected seeds, to mature rapidly, to sprout after disturbances, and to establish symbiotic relationships with fungi, bacteria, and pollinators, made flowering plants the most ecologically successful group in Earth's history. The angiosperm radiation extended beyond diversity in shape and color. These plants altered atmospheric dynamics by increasing transpiration, promoting cloud formation and regular rainfall in tropical regions. They also influenced the development of rich soils, with thinner and more extensive roots that enhanced nutrient cycling. The decomposition of their leaves, richer in nitrogen than those of gymnosperms, accelerated the organic matter cycle. The humid tropical forests, like the modern Amazon, are a direct result of angiosperm dominance. Systems where vegetation feeds itself, generates its own rainfall, recycles its nutrients, and sustains thousands of species in dynamic balance. With the dominance of angiosperms, vegetation began to organize Earth's biological time. Flowering marked the seasons, guided animal migrations, regulated insect reproduction, and ensured the food supply for countless species. The scent of flowers directed bees' flight paths. Fruit colors shaped the feeding behavior of primates. Seeds began to tell stories. Seeds that lie dormant until fire passes. Seeds that only germinate after passing through an animal's stomach. Seeds that require freezing or heavy rain to break dormancy. Each one is a strategy refined by natural selection. Plants were no longer merely surviving, they were manipulating their surroundings with unprecedented biological subtlety. And that included human beings. Long before agriculture, hominids already depended on flowering plants for their diet. Roots, tubers, fruits, leaves, edible flowers. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors grew closer to angiosperms, first as gatherers, then as cultivators. Wheat, corn, rice, barley, sorghum, beans, all these are domesticated angiosperms. The agricultural revolution that gave rise to civilization was built on floral botany. Human culture is rooted in the flowering of angiosperms. Their rhythms became calendars, their cycles became rituals, their seeds promises of the future. Visually, Earth was transformed into a garden planet. Flowering fields stretched across hills and plains. Deciduous forests exploded in vibrant colors in autumn. Fruit trees dotted valleys with reds, purples, and yellows. Winds carried fragrances. Mountains wore floral cloaks during blooming seasons. Vegetation became a sensory experience, engaging not only sight but also smell, taste, and touch. Aesthetics became part of function, and even without consciousness, plants bloomed with purpose. Every shape, every color, every aroma was an adaptation and a promise of life, continuity, and symbiosis with the surrounding world. The explosion of flowers is, therefore, the pinnacle of plant sophistication, a moment when green life reached its greatest level of complexity, interaction, beauty, and function. And it is also the point where vegetation touched every other kingdom of life, influencing insects, fish, birds, mammals, fungi, bacteria, and humans. The planet became definitively a planet of flowers. And under this new floral mantle, Earth would learn to withstand impacts, survive extinctions, and sustain civilizations. Because where there is a flower, there is a pollinator. Where there is fruit, there is a disperser. Where there is a seed, there is hope. With the rise of angiosperms and the explosion of flowers during the Cretaceous, one of the most remarkable evolutionary alliances in Earth's history began: the intimate coevolution between flowering plants and insects. At the heart of this relationship was pollen, the microscopic grain carrying the male gamete of plants, which would become the vital link between the immobile plant and the mobile animal. Pollen was the vehicle of plant genetic inheritance, and over time also became a reward, a form of currency, a chemical language, and a survival strategy. The age of pollen is not merely a chapter in botanical history. It is the story of how flowers created loyal, multifunctional partners, how insects evolved to understand them, and how together they transformed the planet into a system of unprecedented biological cooperation. Unlike gymnosperms, which primarily depend on wind to disperse their pollen grains, angiosperms developed flowers designed to attract living vectors. Nectar production, petal coloration, flower shape, ultraviolet patterns invisible to the human eye, and volatile scents are all mechanisms designed to seduce specific pollinators. Insects such as bees, beetles, butterflies, wasps, moths, and flies became specialists in visiting flowers, collecting pollen, transporting gametes, and ensuring cross-fertilization. In exchange, they received food, shelter, warmth, and, in many cases, protection from predators. This exchange between nutrition and reproduction formed the basis of a symbiosis that intensified over millions of years. In this context, pollen evolved into highly adaptive forms. Each plant group developed grains with distinct shapes, sizes, and surface structures optimized to adhere to specific parts of specific pollinators' bodies. Some pollen grains have microscopic spikes to cling to bee hairs. Others have tough outer coats to survive an insect's digestive tract. Some form cohesive masses called pollinia, which attach to moths' legs or faces and are transported like cargo. The coevolution between plant and insect refined these adaptations to the point that many flower species became dependent on a single type of insect, and vice versa. The reproductive success of one relied on the survival and behavior of the other. It was an alliance that united genetics, ecology, and behavior into a single biological symphony. This era of animal pollination profoundly reshaped the rhythm and structure of global vegetation. Forests became acoustic and sensory ecosystems, filled with buzzing, flight aromas and colors marking the daily cycle. Flowers were not just eye-catching. They were programmed to bloom at specific times, aligned with their pollinators' activity. Some opened at dawn, others at dusk, and some only at night, when moths and bats assumed the role of pollinators. Some released sweet aromas, others mimicked the scent of rotting meat to attract necrophilous insects. Some moved, closed, or contracted upon contact. All of it was to ensure pollen reached the right place at the right time, with the right chance of reproductive success. Over time, the impact of this relationship extended beyond the plant and insect worlds. Coevolution began to influence landscapes, climates, and entire food chains. As flowers became more specialized, pollinating insects diversified explosively. Bees, in particular, evolved as masters of pollination, forming colonies, developing body structures for carrying pollen, and creating floral fidelity, visiting the same species repeatedly to ensure effective fertilization. Butterflies developed long proboscises adapted to tubular flowers. Beetles, with keen sense of smell, pollinated strong-scented flowers. Flies took on the role in colder regions or those with lower floral diversity. Every insect found its flower, and every flower shaped its insect. This system of interdependence brought both ecological stability and vulnerability. The more specific the relationship, the more sensitive it became to environmental disturbances. The extinction of a pollinator could mean the end of a plant. The loss of a flower could collapse an entire insect population. This delicate balance still sustains 75% of cultivated plants. Worldwide, all dependent on animal pollinators. Fruits, vegetables, oil crops, medicinal plants, all are part of this reciprocity system born in the age of pollen. The modern decline of bees and other pollinators is thus a direct threat to global food security, biodiversity, and the very face of the landscape. Visually, the world after this coevolution became more fluid, dynamic, colorful, and mobile. Vegetation did more than grow. It communicated with its surroundings using chemical, visual, and temporal signals. The flower became a language, the pollen a messenger, the insect a courier of genetic promises, and fertilization an act of partnership. A flowering field is not merely beautiful, it is a symphony of ongoing ecological interactions, where each bee's flight is a line written in the story of life. Thus, the age of pollen shows us that the success of vegetation did not stem solely from plant structures or genetic innovations. It also came from the ability to connect with other forms of life, to become necessary, desirable, indispensable. The flowering of the planet is not only botanical, it is relational. It is a story of trust between distinct kingdoms, between beings that do not speak but understand one another. And in every flower visited, every pollen carried, every bud that emerges, the plant and animal worlds reaffirm the same pact, to grow together in harmony with time and Earth. Approximately 66 million years ago, Earth was struck by one of the most catastrophic events in its history. The impact of an asteroid more than 10 kilometers wide in the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The collision triggered a chain of devastating consequences: global wildfires, colossal tsunamis, violent earthquakes, and the ejection of dust and aerosols that blocked sunlight for months or even years. This so-called impact winter caused a brutal drop in temperature, the collapse of photosynthesis, and consequently the breakdown of entire food chains. Around 75% of Earth's species went extinct, including all non-avian dinosaurs. And yet, amid the chaos and darkness, plants survived. More than that, they became fundamental to the reconstruction of the biosphere. Plants, especially angiosperms, possessed a crucial evolutionary advantage: the seed. Many seeds can remain viable even under extreme conditions, waiting weeks, months, or years until environmental conditions once again become suitable for germination. This capacity for adaptive dormancy allowed a significant portion of the global seed bank to withstand the cold, the darkness, and the scarcity. When atmospheric dust began to settle and the first rays of sunlight reached the ground once more, the seeds sprouted. Green returned. In silence, in soil still warm from the ashes, vegetation began to breathe again. Not all plants, however, were equally successful in surviving. Gymnosperms, which had dominated forests in many biomes, suffered severe losses. Many conifers were decimated by global fires. Entire conifer forests disappeared, especially in the northern hemisphere. Angiosperms, on the other hand, with their diversity, rapid reproduction strategies, and fruit-protected seeds, proved far more resilient. Herbaceous short-cycle species dominated the first years after the impact, growing quickly, covering the ground, and creating microclimates favorable to other species. Ferns also thrived in the immediate aftermath, thanks to their ability to reproduce rapidly via spores. In fact, fossils from this period reveal what paleobotanists call the fern spike, a sharp increase in fern spore abundance right after the impact. Post-impact vegetation rebuilt not only ecosystems, but also the planetary climate. The photosynthesis of resurgent plants helped extract atmospheric carbon dioxide, rebalancing the greenhouse effect. Roots stabilized eroded soil, leaves restarted transpiration cycles, and the re-emerging forests began to attract back insects, small mammals, birds, and surviving reptiles. In this sense, plants were engineers of resilience. They rebuilt the foundation of life, the primary trophic level, upon which the rest of the living world could rely to begin anew. And it was this new vegetation that would feed the mammals that, from then on, assumed the evolutionary spotlight left vacant by the dinosaurs. It is within this context that the first modern forests emerged. As environments stabilized, woody angiosperms such as fruit trees began to spread again. New species appeared, adapted to the transformed world. The separation of continents, milder climates, and new interactions with mammalian pollinators and dispersers led to the creation of innovative ecosystems. Tropical rainforests, savannas, grasslands, and shrublands, each with their own distinct plant communities. Botanical diversity in the Paleogene, spanning tens of millions of years after the impact, reached unprecedented levels. Vegetation became multiform, multicolored, and multifunctional. Moreover, the reorganization of plant life influenced the evolution of mammals, which began to exploit niches created by flowering plants. Rodents fed on seeds, primates took to flower-laden canopies, ruminants grazed on grasses, and bats found nourishment in nocturnal blooms. Plants also directly influenced geological processes. Tropical forests accelerated the formation of deep soils, the increase in plant biomass intensified carbon cycling, and climate transition events were partly regulated by vegetation growth rates. The post-asteroid Earth became a world shaped by roots and leaves. Visually, the recovery of vegetation was a gradual yet powerful spectacle. First, mosses and ferns reclaimed exposed rocks. Then grasses and shrubs began to sprout, creating green mosaics. Soon after, young trees rose from scorched plains. And finally, flowers returned, coloring a world that had reopened to light. A planet once blanketed in ash, dust, and silence was slowly repainted in shades of green, pink, yellow, and blue. Each new sprout was a symbol of persistence, each flower a silent cry of rebirth, each forest a natural cathedral raised by Earth itself to celebrate its own resilience. The survival and resilience of plants after the asteroid impact was not just a victory of biology. It was a cosmic declaration that life, even in the face of the greatest tragedy, finds a way to bloom again. And within that blooming lay the embryo of human civilization. For it was this vegetation, patiently rebuilt through botanical determination, that would feed, shelter, and inspire our ancestors. The story of vegetation after the impact is, therefore, the story of the world's reconstruction. And it was this new green world that prepared the stage for the next great turning point in Earth's history, the arrival of the human species, and its complex, ambiguous, and profound relationship with plants. With the resilience of plants after the Cretaceous cataclysm and the reconstruction of ecosystems throughout the Paleogene, the planet once again became a lush world. Tropical forests consolidated, grasslands spread, and vegetation, now dominated by angiosperms, became not only diverse but strategically interlinked with the surviving animals. It was in this setting that the first primates emerged, and over millions of years they would eventually give rise to the human species. But the appearance of Homo sapiens was not just another evolutionary branch of fauna. It marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of vegetation, where nature would start to be shaped by conscious intelligence. For the first time, plants would be domesticated, and with that, the green world would cease to be purely natural. It would become cultural, symbolic, and economic. Early hominids, as hunter-gatherers, already had an intimate relationship with vegetation. They understood plant cycles, the uses of roots, leaves, flowers, and fruits. They knew where seasonal foods sprouted, which species were medicinal, and which were poisonous. This ancestral ethnobotanical wisdom, rooted in deep observation and coexistence with nature, allowed humans to inhabit every continent, adapting to diverse biomes. However, the true turning point came when human groups around 10 to 12,000 years ago began domesticating plants, a silent, gradual, but profoundly transformative process. By planting seeds, selecting the best fruits, and preserving productive varieties, humans initiated agriculture, and with it, Earth's vegetation began to change intentionally. The first domesticated plants emerged independently in various parts of the world. In the Fertile Crescent came wheat, barley, and legumes. In China, rice and millet. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yam. In Southeast Asia, banana and taro. Each civilization created, based on its local vegetation, unique agricultural systems shaped by climate, soil, culture, and necessity. Plants no longer grew where they pleased, they grew where humans willed them to. Artificial selection, over generations, modified the genetic traits of species. Larger fruits, more nutritious seeds, reduced toxicity, greater resistance to storage. Agriculture turned vegetation into an extension of the human body, a living technology in service of survival. With agriculture came cities, empires, roads, markets, and religions, and in each of these contexts, plants were present. They were food, medicine, clothing, shelter, spiritual symbol, and currency. Forests were cleared for farmland, new irrigation systems altered river courses, mountains were carved into agricultural terraces, deserts received palms and dates. Planetary vegetation began to display artificial landscapes created by human hands. Landscapes that reflected not only function, but also aesthetics and cultural identity. Mirror-like rice paddies, symmetrical vineyards, hanging gardens, orchard rows. The green of the world now obeyed the human gaze, a designed green. But this domestication was not merely practical. Plants began to inhabit the symbolic imagination of civilizations. Wheat became a metaphor for prosperity. The vine, a symbol of communion. The olive tree, an emblem of peace. Bamboo, a sign of resilience. The lotus, a figure of enlightenment. Vegetation entered myths, religions, and rituals. Leaves decorated temples. Grains marked sacred seasons. Fruits offered promises to the gods. Humans came to see plants not just as sustenance, but as spiritual mirrors, metaphors of time, and channels of divine connection. The garden became a symbol of paradise, the tree of wisdom, the sprout of rebirth, the harvest of justice. It was the beginning of a new relationship, deeper, denser, and more ambiguous. In the millennia that followed, domesticated vegetation underwent technological revolutions. the invention of the plough, the use of draft animals, channeled irrigation and crop rotation. More recently, with the Industrial Revolution and the Green Revolution, came chemical fertilizers, pesticides, genetically modified organisms, and mechanized farming systems. Plant production increased exponentially, supporting fast-growing human populations. But this advancement came with consequences: soil erosion, massive deforestation, biodiversity loss, aquifer pollution, and global warming. Artificial vegetation, now dominant in vast monocultures, began to impoverish the natural landscape, and the ancient balance between humans and plants began to collapse. Visually, the modern world displays stark contrasts. On one side, untouched forests still survive in tropical regions, boasting astonishing botanical diversity. On the other, millions of hectares of a single cultivated species, soy, wheat, or corn, stretch to the horizon. Forests became pasture, swamps became fields, mangroves became marinas, and original vegetation gave way to functional greenery. Even cities filled with concrete and glass maintain their relationship with plants through ornamental gardens, urban farms, flower beds, and public parks. Green persists, adapted, reinvented, though often confined, domesticated, and trimmed to urban taste. The arrival of humanity thus marks the transition of vegetation from an autonomous agent of evolution to a partner shaped by culture, technology, and human desire. And within this partnership, which has produced both beauty and destruction, lies one of today's greatest ecological dilemmas. Plants still sustain our lives at every level, from photosynthesis to food, from breath to shelter, from landscape to spirit. But by altering their logic, we have come to depend on their obedience, not their freedom. Vegetation now reflects not only climate and soil, but also human decisions, economic, political, and moral. And it is up to the species that reshaped the green world to ask itself, what vegetal future do we want to cultivate? With the arrival of the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, humanity entered a new cycle of planetary transformation, one that would have profound and devastating consequences for vegetation. The steam engine, mechanization of labor, the burning of coal and later oil, accelerated urbanization, and explosive population growth not only changed how humans lived, but also redrew Earth's vegetative landscape on an unprecedented scale. Forests were cleared to make way for mines, railways, roads, and cities. Agricultural fields were turned into mechanized monocultures, and vegetation ceased to be an autonomous organism of the planet to become a functional cog in the global economy, shaped by the logic of productivity, profit, and territorial expansion. In the great industrial cities of the 19th century, vegetation vanished from urban centers. Trees were cut to open avenues, gardens gave way to brick buildings and soot-spewing factories, canalized rivers eliminated wetlands and vegetated banks. Green became a luxury, a marginalized remnant pushed to the outskirts of urban zones. The only remaining vegetation was found in public parks, spaces designed to ease the impact of urban growth on the physical and mental health of the population. At the same time, tropical forests began to be commercially exploited on a global scale. Timber, rubber, oils, medicinal herbs, and exotic plants became export commodities. Forests were now viewed as resources, not as ecosystems. Industrialization also led to the expansion of monocultures, which replaced traditional diverse agricultural systems with vast plantations of a single species: soy, corn, wheat, sugarcane, cotton, coffee. This simplification of land use caused ecological impoverishment, loss of plant genetic diversity, soil degradation, increased dependence on fertilizers and pesticides, and heightened vulnerability to pests and diseases. Soils became increasingly artificial, drained, compacted, chemically treated. Roots no longer found complexity, only repetition. Native vegetation was removed as an obstacle, and the world began to revolve around economic plant species, cultivated as machines for food, energy, or industrial production. Air pollution from factories and automobiles profoundly altered plant physiology. Toxic gases like sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides began affecting photosynthesis, stomatal function, and even leaf pigmentation. Urban vegetation became pale, diseased, suffocated by soot, Acid rain affected entire forests, dissolving essential soil minerals and causing necrosis in leaves and stems. Even in rural areas, pesticide contamination began interfering with plant biology, reducing microbial activity in soil and disrupting nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Global vegetation gradually entered a state of chronic stress, overwhelmed by a planet that prioritized speed, consumption, and profit. At the same time, international trade began moving plants between continents as commodities. Exotic species were introduced into ecosystems lacking natural predators, becoming invasive. Local vegetation was suppressed by African grasses in tropical pastures, fast-growing pines in temperate forests, and eucalyptus in semi-arid regions. Though profitable, these species altered water balance, impoverished soils, and hindered the natural regeneration of native flora. Urban landscaping, in turn, began to favor aesthetics over ecology. Showy flowers that didn't feed pollinators, trimmed lawns requiring constant irrigation, trees pruned out of season, exposed roots, plant life maintained under rigid aesthetic control. This imbalance culminated in a planetary ecological crisis. Massive deforestation, especially in biomes like the Amazon, the Congo, and Southeast Asia, drastically reduced Earth's primary vegetative cover. The loss of forests impacted rainfall patterns, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and global climate stability. Forest fires, intensified by agricultural practices and climate change, began destroying millions of hectares annually. Vegetation, once a climatic buffer and ecological stabilizer, began to be consumed, burned, extracted, stacked, and exported as if it were an inexhaustible resource. But it wasn't. Visually, the planet began to show clear signs of collapse. Satellite images revealed dry patches where dense forests once stood. Rivers flowed between barren banks. Erosion carved scars into the landscape. Green was disappearing. And where it persisted, it was often the artificial green of monocultures, homogeneous, silent, inert. Vegetation stopped whispering diversity. It began echoing repetition. Even remaining forests began to suffer from fragmentation syndrome. Isolated, impoverished, pressured on all sides, vegetation was entering a silent collapse, and with it, Earth's stability. The Industrial Age thus marks the moment when vegetation ceased to be a co-author in the story of life and became a victim of human history, and that rupture carries deep costs. The ecological crisis is, to a large extent, a botanical crisis. Vegetation regulates the climate, sustains biodiversity, feeds the atmosphere, and anchors the soil. And by compromising its functions, we compromise everything. Urbanization without greenery, agriculture without diversity, consumption without regeneration, all are symptoms of a civilization severed from its deepest root. Yet even amid collapse, vegetation still reveals its strength. With unexpected regrowth, flowers breaking through asphalt, seeds persisting in soil, and secondary forests beginning to rise again. Green still wants to live. It still wants to breathe. It still wants to heal. Today we live in a new geological era proposed by many scientists, the Anthropocene, a time when human activity has become the dominant force transforming the planet, affecting the climate, oceans, soils, atmosphere, and, profoundly, global vegetation. In this age marked by growing environmental imbalance, vegetation plays two opposing yet simultaneous roles. It is both a victim of the devastation caused by centuries of unsustainable exploitation and a protagonist in the search for solutions to the climate and ecological crisis. It is in this critical threshold of Earth's history that humans begin to see plants once again, not as mere resources, but as living allies capable of restoring the lost balance. Ecological restoration has become one of the most vital fields in conservation biology. Across the world, ambitious projects aim to recover degraded forests, replant native vegetation, restore riverbanks and ecological corridors, reconnect forest fragments, and return original plant life to its native biomes. In Brazil, initiatives like the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact strive to replant millions of hectares with native species, restoring vital ecological functions such as aquifer recharge, carbon storage, and biodiversity protection. In Africa's Sahel, the Great Green Wall aims to revive thousands of kilometers of desertified landscapes, In China, large-scale reforestation projects seek to combat erosion and air pollution. In each of these efforts, vegetation is treated not as a backdrop, but as essential natural infrastructure for life. Another emerging focus is urban forestry. As more than half the world's population now lives in cities, there is growing awareness that without urban vegetation, there is no health, well-being, or climate resilience. City trees reduce heat islands, filter pollutants, absorb noise, promote rainwater infiltration, provide shelter for wildlife, and improve quality of life. Initiatives such as planting green corridors, green roofs, community gardens, linear parks, and school woodlands show that it is possible to reintroduce greenery into concrete, creating cities that breathe, sweat, and bloom alongside their inhabitants. When well planned, urban vegetation becomes more than scenery. It becomes public health infrastructure, a symbol of citizenship, and a tool for environmental justice. The movement for agroforestry and regenerative agriculture is also gaining momentum, offering food production models based on the logic of the forest. Instead of intensive, destructive monocultures, it promotes the integration of trees, food crops, and native species in syntropic systems, where each plant nourishes and protects the others, mimicking the intelligence of natural ecosystems. These systems restore soil, capture carbon, promote biodiversity, and produce food with fewer chemical inputs. In this model, plants return to their role as partners in abundance, rather than cogs in an exhausting production engine. Food becomes not an extraction, but a collaboration between humans and vegetation. Science is also revealing new invisible dimensions of plant life. Studies on plant communication, such as mycelial networks that connect roots through underground fungi, show that forests function as cooperative communities, where trees exchange nutrients, alerts, and chemical signals. Traditional knowledge from indigenous peoples, such as agroforestry systems and fire-managed landscapes, is once again recognized as sophisticated ecological technology. Vegetation is no longer seen merely as an object of study, but as a source of ancestral, biomimetic, and relational knowledge. Learning from plants is becoming increasingly essential for survival. Even in symbolic realms, green is regaining its spiritual power. There is a rising interest in medicinal gardens, healing herbs, ecological spirituality, forest bathing, and meditating among trees. In times of climate crisis and collective anxiety, contact with vegetation offers more than shade. It provides emotional healing, nervous system regulation, and a reconnection with natural time. The modern human, disconnected from the earth, rediscovers that the simple act of walking among trees or tending a garden is an act of resistance, of hope, of return. Green is no longer merely an external landscape. It becomes an inner territory once again. The future of vegetation in the Anthropocene is, therefore, a field of choices. We can continue down the path of deforestation, chaotic urban sprawl, toxic agriculture, and uniform landscapes. Or we can restore, reforest, diversify, cultivate wisely, and listen to the teachings of plants. What is at stake is not just the beauty of ecosystems, but the very habitability of the planet. The collapse of vegetation is the collapse of life as we know it, but its regeneration is also our own. The green we plant today is not just shade for the future, it is time, water, air, and meaning for the generations to come. Visually, we can imagine a planet where green returns to cities, where forests connect continents, where food is born in living, biodiverse systems, and where every human being understands that plant life is the very foundation of the living earth, a civilization that has learned from leaves, from roots, and from cycles, and by making peace with vegetation, has made peace with itself. Faced with the ecological and climate challenges of the 21st century, the future of vegetation stands as one of the greatest frontiers of science, philosophy, and human survival. It is no longer enough to simply preserve what remains. We must deeply understand how plants function, develop new ways to interact with and regenerate them, and above all, recognize their silent intelligence as an active force in planetary life. Vegetation, which has accompanied us from the primordial seas to the concrete cities, is now at the heart of a civilizational crossroads, where the future will be green, or it will not be. Plant biotechnology emerges as a powerful tool to confront both the climate and food crises. Scientists are developing genetically modified plants with greater resistance to drought, heat, and pests, adapted to degraded or extreme soils. New cultivars promise more efficient production using fewer resources, reducing the need for pesticides and fertilizers. Genetic engineering also enables the creation of trees that grow faster and absorb more carbon from the atmosphere, making them allies in the fight against global warming. There are even experimental projects involving plant bioprinting, where living tissues are grown in laboratories to create green structures on demand, like living rooftops, plant-based solar panels, and even furniture made of grown, not cut, fibers. But the green future is not limited to genetic manipulation. There is a growing return to the study of more traditional, native, and heirloom seeds, preserved by farming and indigenous communities across generations. Seed banks like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in the Arctic, or local seed exchange initiatives, protect plant genetic diversity from silent extinction. This diversity is vital not only for food security, but also for ecological resilience in the face of unpredictable changes. Preserving seeds is not an act of nostalgia, it is an evolutionary strategy. Each seed carries centuries of adaptation, empirical knowledge, and regenerative potential. They are, quite literally, capsules of the future. At the same time, research into plant neurobiology is expanding, a fascinating field exploring perception, memory, communication, and even decision-making in plants. Although they lack brains, plants process environmental information, recognize relatives, respond to stimuli with complex strategies, and communicate with other plants and organisms through electrical, chemical, and even vibrational signals. Experiments show that some species learn from past experiences, remember patterns, and adapt their behavior independently of genetic change. Plant intelligence, therefore, is not a copy of our own. It is a distinct form of cognition, decentralized, sensory, and deeply connected to the environment. To acknowledge it requires a new ecological consciousness. In architecture and design, biophilia, the innate impulse to connect with life, has begun to inspire projects where vegetation ceases to be ornament and becomes structure. Living buildings, cities with ecological corridors, breathing facades, urban spaces that mimic forests. The future of metropolises will be vertical, yes, but also green, humid, shaded, and sensitive. Technology merges with botany. Sensors monitor the well-being of urban trees, drones track reforestation efforts, algorithms predict blooming cycles, and irrigation is managed by artificial intelligence. Innovation no longer competes with nature. It begins to imitate it, amplify it, and serve it. In spirituality and philosophy, new movements are proposing a vegetal ethic, treating plants as beings with intrinsic value, with their own rights, and an active role in the web of life. The idea that the plant world possesses agency, memory, sensitivity, and purpose redefines our position as a dominant species. We are not masters of the green. We are part of it. This thinking is reflected in emotionally guided forest management, respectful agriculture in sync with plant timing, and even rituals where planting becomes a sacred act. Planting becomes a philosophical, political, and spiritual gesture. Visually, we can imagine the future as a living tapestry of clean technologies, regenerated forests, communities integrated into the landscape, and cities that bloom. Vegetation, finally respected in its complexity, expands again, not as a reaction to chance, but as a conscious alliance between nature and humanity. Cultivated fields become biodiverse. Urban forests become normal. The seeds of tomorrow circulate as shared heritage. And green is no longer just the background, it becomes the protagonist of the world we wish to leave behind. The future of vegetation is, at its core, the future of Earth itself, because it is plants that hold the soil, purify the air, cool the planet, and nourish both bodies and ideas. It is they who connect the worlds, from mineral to animal, from visible to invisible, from past to what is yet to come. And as long as there is one leaf sprouting, one seed enduring, one root persisting, hope will remain alive, green, silent, and expanding.